Willkommen in einem anderen Aufregungsvideo, or welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 32 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, which in this case will be covering how to cover your bases and playing area with fine turf or other turf, as well as selecting optimum fine turf colours for your bases and playing areas. My opinions on how to cover bases and playing areas has dramatically changed in the last 3 years. When I came back to the hobby, I did not like how my elements were so dark and how I kept on losing elements on the playing area. So as a result, I came up with the brilliant idea of using a very light coloured flock or turf so the figures were quite obvious on the base. At least that was my initial theory when I came back into the hobby. This shows what this initial idea resulted in. I use cardboard bases on my figures, which I actually always had in the past, and used a very light green turf from Noch. The playing area, while not exactly the same type of turf, was reasonably close in colour. I used a very low cost flock turf on my playing area as I felt that was all that was needed for a playing area. There is no doubt the figures are easier to see, but it didn't take me long to identify some major problems. If you look very carefully at the turf on both the base and even the playing area, you can see that it's incredibly coarse. Zoomed up this close, it looks like the figures are travelling over green boulders, which looks kind of okay from a distance, but when you look closely, it definitely does not look very good. The same obviously also applied to the playing area. The flock was simply too coarse for 6mm figures. I suspect even for 15mm it would have been too coarse, although perhaps it would have been acceptable for 25. Although, you know what, even if I had 25mm figures, which I don't possess, I don't think I'd go this coarse. The first thing that I focused on was the base, the cardboard bases. I was never very happy with cardboard bases. The edges didn't look very nice, and it was very difficult to cut out to be exactly the correct size. So I decided to move to MDF bases. I then decided at the same time to use a finer turf and try and get some multiple tones on the base. Now, the most fine turf which I could obtain from Noch is what you can see here. The flock was slightly darker, but I covered the base with some lighter coloured brush to lighten it up. This was kind of an improvement, but the turf was still far too coarse, and the brush made the base look rather messy. Initially I kind of liked it compared with my old cardboard bases and my very coarse turf, but I quickly realised this type of diorama actually started covering the figure, and with infantry it made the figures almost invisible on the base. Perhaps this was historically accurate. You wouldn't want to be seen if you were in a World War II or a modern battles environment, but I preferred to look at the figures because I wanted to see the bling, or I wanted to see the evidence of all the effort that I had basically made to create the figures for the game. Nonetheless, I did upgrade my figures, and initially I was kind of pleased with it and I found it acceptable. So then I started looking at my playing area, because at this point I had not upgraded it. Now, my old playing area does give me with a very playable surface, which kind of looks okay, but you can see here it really doesn't look realistic in any way, shape or form, and it simply doesn't scratch my required diorama itch. If you look carefully at this, first of all, the green doesn't look particularly good. In order to avoid the horrible monotone colour, I put in different shades of turf to reflect fields, etc., which kind of, made it look better, but still didn't look particularly good. And if you look carefully at the hill here, the edges look awful. They're a flat edge, and this is a 2-layer hill. It just doesn't look particularly good. Now, while I was considering what to do with my playing area, someone who viewed some of my video asked me a few questions about covering turf and some rules, Panzerkorps in this particular case. And he provided me some pictures of the playing area that he'd created. I thought it looked very good, with the key point being that he used a multi-tone surface and used a very high quality fine turf, in this case which came from woodlands. So taking these ideas, I decided to try and duplicate it myself, and this was an early effort. The main improvements that you can see here was the use of fine turf from woodlands. and my hills now had rounded edges. And of course I decided to upgrade my built-up areas and used actual models on it instead of pseudo balsa wood blocks that kind of vaguely looked like buildings. Now, there were some interesting issues with these terrain features and the flocking style. I discovered that with large surfaces you need larger but fewer two-tone patches, and I needed to reduce the contrast. Now what you can see here is that the light colour is a burnt or a very light brown, which simply looked too light compared to the green, and there were too many patches all over the place, which didn't look great. Looked better than my older terrain, but it still didn't look great. The other thing I noticed was that the edges on my hills were still too steep. I needed to make the edges at least 1 centimetre deep, so the slope was certainly not as steep as you see here. Now the built-up areas that you see here are made up of two pieces, the base which does not move and the building which is on top of it. Now I basically considered that the bases were too thick and too large, so I now use 2mm thick MDF bases with a finer light grey ballast on it, and it's exactly one base width square. As a result, my larger buildings don't fit on it, but as pretty much 90% of all my buildings could fit on a 4 centimetre base, this was not a particular issue for me. So armed with this knowledge, I went off and continued to develop my playing area. This is part of a 3 foot by 4 foot playing area. The water features and roads are embedded, as they look better even if this reduces the flexibility of the playing area I create. The two-tone effect uses larger second tone areas, as you can see here. I noticed this when I renovated my kitchen and purchased a new benchtop. The sample of the simulated marble looked good on a small sample, but when I saw a full-size benchtop in the showroom, it looked horrible. It was covered by thousands of small spots and looked more like a disease, a picture from a doctor about a disease. The same occurs with two-tone playing areas. Each patch should be more than 1 foot in length, and the number needs to be kept reasonably low. There was another interesting effect related to contrast. A small area requires more contrast difference than a large area. So in this case, the green was green blend and the brown was brown blend. And the difference in the tone actually doesn't look very great when you compare the unapplied flock. But as you can see here, there's more than enough tone difference. Now my earlier terrain, the previous image that you used yellow grass for the brown, and it stuck out far too much and looked particularly awful, particularly in pictures. Yet for bases, you need this level of contrast to even notice the two-tone effect, which I'll be showing in a moment. When I created a number of different playing areas and started doing some playtesting, one of the interesting things that I noticed was that the most useful terrain piece, or area terrain piece, that's hills, woods and swamps, etc., was basically a multiple of base width. And the most useful one was 2 base width long, with 1 base width wide and a 1 centimetre lip running all the way around it. Now I also found a 1 base width square area terrain piece with a 1 centimetre lip, also quite useful. But really anything larger than that I very rarely used. Now this made life simple, as all I needed to do was create a few dozen of each of these two sizes. Half I allocated as woods, the other halves were hills, and I normally had 1 swamp and 1 lake piece as well. Now the built-up areas were all exactly 1 base width square, as you saw earlier, so I'm not talking about them. Now I did create a very large hill for a specific scenario, and while it worked for the scenario, it's not useful in pretty much any other game I ever played. It's also harder to transport, and it's very hard to fit on an empty spot on a playing area. For the same scenario, I also created a large terrain feature containing my water features. Now, the scenario I played was Marengo. It was the old SPI board game Marengo, which used a figure game conversion. So I had to create a playing area, 3x4, that looked exactly like, or pretty close to the board game playing area, and that's why I created this. Now, this kind of terrain piece does work, particularly for my Marengo scenario, but it's, again, hard to transport, hard to store, and really only useful for this single scenario, which I must admit is a particularly good game to play. Now, in my attempt to create more generic playing areas, I did go down the path of creating generic terrain pieces, as you can see here. However, it was generally a failure and I pretty much never used them. This shows the problem with large terrain pieces, trying to fit them on a playing area. In the end, they can only be placed generally in a single location with some minimal modifications or movement. And with that level of inflexibility, the value of these type of terrain pieces is very low indeed. While I do have a problem with water features and roads, generally I'm quite happy with the playing area, so I decided to relook at my bases. While I've standardised on MDF bases, I did have a number of issues with my figures. The edges of these bases look pretty horrible. The label at the rear looked messy, and of course the flock was not attractive. I labelled the bottom of all these bases, not for, like designation of units, just simply to tell me what the figure is, and the edge of that also looks horrible. Now, in order to solve it, I had to rethink my base entirely. Now, before I go into the actual solution, the thickness. Many people have stated that, or indicated that 3mm may be too thick. Now, the optimum thickness of a base, I agree, is as thin as possible, with 2mm being my standard for 15mm figures. However, for 6mm figures, I found the thickness was very useful for picking up a figure, especially infantry. So as a result, I used 3mm for 6mm figures. I did try metal bases and plastic bases, and they were absolutely a nightmare because the only way you could pick up infantry was by grabbing a poor guy's head, and I actually ended up destroying some of my figures as a result. So particularly for infantry, you need thick bases, and you want all the bases to be the same. However, saying all that, for 15mm figures, where you don't have that problem, I always use 2mm thick bases, and actually metal bases which are thinner would probably be also quite viable. In my revamp, the first thing I learned was to ensure the bases were painted a colour as close to the base flock as possible. The new method I now use often leaves gaps, that is, new method of applying the fine turf, often leaves gaps or very thinly covered section. So the base colour must be the same, or at least a natural colour such as a soil colour, which is also quite adequate. The second point is that you should always use a spray paint. Paint brushed on the base can result in messy edges and an uneven surface. I normally use a dark green spray paint from a craft shop as it's cheaper, but if you want to use a higher cost Tamiya spray paints or even a compressor, that's certainly acceptable if much more costly. Next thing I looked at was the edges. When you purchase professionally made bases, the edges are normally painted, but the colour can be uneven. I now ensure the edges are black, although dark brown could also be suitable. After a lot of experimentation, I settled on using a permanent ink marker. I use black because it's simple, cheap and easy to obtain, as you can see here. Now the tip of the ink marker needs to be flat, so you can run it along the marker edge and cover the entire edge. What you can see here is a pile of figures that have been edged, and you can see the edges are nice and black. Now, sometimes the black sort of overruns onto the base, but it really doesn't matter. If it overruns on the green side, the flock covers it and black is okay. And if it overruns on the base, well, who cares? You never see it. And anyway, I cover these with labels anyway, so it disappears. Now we come to flocking. After my success with playing areas using woodland fine turf, I decided to use the same thing on my bases. Now the result is darker than I like, but I have to admit the two-tone effect does look good. The fine turf is very fine and you don't get the boulder or gravel effect of coarser turf. This actually fits in very well with 6mm figures and probably even 15 plus figures as well. When I started experimenting, I discovered my contrast lesson that I'd learnt with the playing area was wrong for bases. As you can see here, the contrast between the green and brown is pretty much invisible. I mean, there is a green patch in the middle here, but you can barely see it. So as a result, I have to edge up to a darker contrast. Incidentally, in this particular case, the brown is brown blend, and the green in the middle is not the green blend which I normally use in my playing area. So because I figured I needed a darker colour, I actually did use a darker green, but it simply wasn't dark enough. So as a result, I now have to go to even a darker green in the centre, which happens to be weeds from woodlands. And that seems to work reasonably well. Now what I'm going to do is go through a brief overview of how I actually flock my bases. In principle, this same process is used for my playing area, although the scale is much larger. Now the first thing we do is we start with the spray painted and black edged 3mm thick MDF bases. Obviously if you're using if you're creating bases for 15mm figures, they would be 2mm thick or possibly even thinner. I then place on each base a blob of PVC glue. You'll notice that this is all in a plastic container. PVC or PVA glue does not stick to plastic, which is why I do it in this. And I also do all my flocking in my house, so I need to put it into a plastic tray so it doesn't get on the floor, which would upset my wife greatly. Using your trusty finger, spread the glue evenly across the base. Try and keep the edges clear of glue and make sure you have some paper towels on around to clean your hands as you do each base, because basically what ends up happening is glue starts sticking to your fingers after each base and it builds up. So by the time you get to the 10th base, you've got a lot of glue on your fingers. So my advice is to try and wipe your fingers probably after every 2 base. But nonetheless, even if you do get a bit of glue on the edges, it's not normally the end of the world. Now place a small amount of your second tone fine turf on the base. In this case I'm using Woodlands Yellow Grass, which is a flock that you'll probably be using a hell of a lot if you go down this particular path. Now you pick up each base and gently hit it with your free fingers in order to spread the fine turf around the base. You don't want to have a pile of fine turf on your base. Now we cover the base with the main toned fine turf. In this case, green blend. Green blend is the fine turf you will almost certainly use the most, followed by the brown blend. Yellow grass and weeds are the next tier of woodlands fine turf that you'll probably use the most. Now, don't leave this flock on here too long. In fact, what I normally do, as soon as I make sure that the turf is right across each base, I almost immediately pick up each of the bases and tap off the excess turf. This shows the bases after you've tapped all the turf off it. As you can see, there is a very distinct two-tone effect. And if I tried this on a playing area using the very light brown, it would really stick out in a very unpleasant manner. But on a base, it works quite well. So you do need a lot of contrast difference on a small surface, such as a base. Now I have to go out into the garage in order to do the next step. Now you first need to make sure your bases are fully dry. I normally leave it for 24 hours before I go to this particular step. Now, in the garage, you basically place all the bases on some sort of surface. I use small pieces of timber, but you know what? You could even still put it on the surface that you spray on, because if you get glue underneath, it's not a big issue. It's only an issue if you get glue and there's something else underneath the base. Now you spray a solution of craft PVA and water over the bases, as you can see here. Now in this case, the bases use the brown blend and weed colour as the second tone. Weed is much darker and gives me enough contrast to be noticeable on this type of base, unlike the bases you saw earlier. On the right, the bases are covered with our PVA solution mixed with water. Now in terms of the density, I used to use 50-50. When you do this particular step, you can even go down to 1/3 glue, 2/3 water. It almost doesn't really matter. As long as you get a good solid layer of glue across your base and you get a white effect. So you could even possibly go even thinner. Just to note, when you create the solution, make sure you put a bit of dishwashing detergent in it in order to make the glue freely flow and move around. I use a craft spray bottle in order to apply my glue. Make sure you clean the bottle out very thoroughly after you've completed a job. Don't throw out the unused solution, as you can always use it later. I normally store it in a separate bottle. Not the bottle that you have the spray thing in it, because if you did that, your spray thing will not spray anymore after a day. When drying, make sure you place the bases on some sort of plastic sheet or surface which is clean or clear of any stuff. You don't want flock or bits of dirt or anything like that sticking to the bottom of your base. Now this shows a thick cardboard which is covered with a stick-on plastic, but any sheet of plastic will do. PVC is glue, and if you leave these bases on a wooden surface, the bases will probably stay there forever. While this photo is slightly out of focus, I normally also then add extra bits of diorama to the base. In this case I use Woodlands Underbrush. When the base is filled with figures, it's hard to add much extra diorama, but as long as you do not go overboard, it's probably worth it. This shows a better view of the underbrush, Woodlands Underbrush, and in this case I use the olive green underbrush. I find the dark green is too dark. Light green probably would be acceptable, but the olive green gives me the best effect in this particular case anyway. Now it's hard to get a list of all the woodland products on a single sheet, so I had to create this myself. This shows you all the woodland products, at least they're turf products. Now these days I only ever use the fine turf, which you can see at the top, and underbrush, which you can't see here, but underbrush normally has similar colours to what you see here. The most common fine turfs that I use are in the top left corner, which is green blend and earth blend. And then after that I use for my contrast colours yellow grass and weed. And sometimes, although rather rarely, I also use soil. I only use the green and earth blend on the playing areas. That gives me sufficient contrast between the two, and I sometimes swap it. So sometimes the green blend is the second tone, and other times the earth blend is the second tone. Depends what sort of effect you want to achieve. Now I use the green blend with yellow grass for one of my sides bases. You know, in this case Germans and probably Napoleonic Prussians and Greek ancients. And then I use the brown blend turf with weeds for the other side. That way, the bases all merge in with my playing area, but there is a slight difference, so you can actually see the opposing bases or this opposing side. Now I use the soil colour for special terrain such as rough terrain, but can use that instead of yellow. But I can also use that instead of yellow grass or weeds for special bases if I so desire. I haven't at the present moment, but it's certainly an option because soil does give me adequate contrast, particularly with the earth blend. Look, I'm not going to pretend my diorama effects are works of arts, as they're not. My objective is to create good-looking playing areas and figures in a manner which is practical and suitable for gameplay. There are many better examples of diorama on the web, some of which are absolutely breathtaking, but they tend to require too much work or are simply not practical to use for a game. This is only one suggestion. I have to admit I've travelled a long and winding road to get here. I suspect this will continue to develop, and probably in the next 3 years I'll have totally different products to offer and totally different effects. Incidentally, this is the French forces on the first day of the Battle of Leipzig, using Napoleonic War board game rules converted for figure gaming. And the playing area that you see here is specifically designed to simulate that particular battlefield. I use this battle area for models in modern warfare and World War II games as well, so it does have some utility beyond this one battle, which is the Battle of Leipzig. For those interested, this shows the position on game turn 3 of the first day. The French have pushed the Austrians and Russians back, but not enough, and the Russian reinforcement army arrives next game turn. As normal, I lost this game, but I can assure you I will not lose the next game. This shows the same battlefield, the river that runs down to Leipzig with the Austrians on the right and left. Perhaps next game I'll play the Austrians instead of the French, and I may have a better chance at victory in that particular case. This is the result of the bases that I created earlier. Now you'll notice the edges are black, so they're less noticeable. Again, you can see that the thick bases don't look as good as thinner bases, but unless you're using metal or plastic, you're never going to get rid of the edges, so black I think tends to work reasonably well. As you can see here, the underbrush does add a little bit more bling to the figure, but the most important thing to note here compared with my earlier figures, because I don't have a very messy, uneven surface, the figures tend to show out a little bit more. It's cleaner, it's neater. I personally think it looks better. Others may disagree. And so comes to close my part 30 player idea video series, in this case how to create or how to flock your bases and playing area and what colours to use. Now I have no doubt that whatever conclusion that I've created here or shown here, I'll probably change my mind in the next couple of weeks. So the purpose of these videos are not to provide you with a definitive answer to anything. The purpose is to basically give people ideas about how they can easily and simply create nicer diorama for their playing areas. Because I can tell you now, even though my background is very much a board game background and I'm perfectly happy with cardboard maps and cardboard pieces, I do really like the bling of figure gaming, and my recent conversion of a Napoleonics SPI board game into figure gaming, and also a World War II and Cold War SPI board gaming into figure gaming, has been quite successful. Still trying to get some of the minor rules issues out of the way, but generally they give me a game which is very similar to the board game and gives me the bling of figure gaming, which I particularly like. So I really do think that this is a great hobby and something that will keep me occupied for many years as I grow older. Denken Sie daran, immer viel Heimat zu kämpfen.